Psyche Running, a selection of poems from the German poet Durs Grünbein, translated by Karen Leeder, has won the Griffin Prize for Poetry in 2025, and I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Leeder. Karen, congratulations to you on this prize.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted. Delighted for Durs, for myself, but also for translation.
Yes. Well, I'm really hoping to talk with you about the poems, about your interest in Durs's poetry, but also about translation. I wonder if we could begin by you reading the title poem from the 2002 collection, Configured Night.
Of course, I'm happy to. Configured Night. Or poetry. What was that again? Seduction by ancient feelings, voice catcher, syllable magic, ars minor of the most elaborate finesse. The chill of self-encounter, a dance between all the stools. Not something half then, nor something whole, yet marked by that certain whiff of excess. For some, a godless prayer, for others, the true absolute real. That zigzag cicatrice, reason, bound up with myth and effect, fresh scars marking the sleeping body with sensitive spots. The echoes return to the source, to the mouth, where sounds are rounded to shape, breath image, exhaled into the frosty air, into the dew-fresh nihil. Led by a magic harness, Ariadne's thread, through the darkness of Aporia's, a chain of happy moments stretching back to the bathing girls by the Nile. Most intimate line, one that cannot be plotted and has thus been escaping all geometry since the world has been thought translatable into formulae, into natural laws. Forget this shameless I and its you, longed into presence from afar. Verse is a diver scouring the depths, searching for treasure on the seabed, out there in the brain. It conspires with burnt-out stars. Metaphors are those flat stones that someone throws from the shore out towards open sea, that skip across, skimming the surface 3, 4, 5, 6 times, if you're lucky, before they sink through the surface like a leaden plum. Rifts that echo through time, philosophy in metre, the joyful music in leaping from word to thing and back. Gifted, some say, while others insist, the product of insight. What remains are the poems, the songs that mortality sings. A travel guide, the very best, in the exodus out of humanity's night.
Thank you very much for reading that, Karen. That's the title poem to the 2002 collection, Configured Night, by Durs Grünbein. And it's also the opening poem of Psyche Running, this compilation that has just won the 2025 Griffin Prize. I'm curious about the choice to make this the very first poem of this collection.
That's a very good question, yes. So this collection picks up. Durs was originally brought into English by Michael Hoffman in his marvellous collection Ashes for Breakfast in 2005. And then this collection picks up after that. But both are selections, and there are so many great poems left aside, of course. In fact, I translated probably twice as many before whittling it down to this. But that poem, it seems, is so important as a statement about poetry, about the seriousness of poetry, about the redemptive qualities of poetry, and also something about its mysterious, its lightness, and yet its rootedness in things kind of ancient. And in fact, that poem from the 2002 collection, which has that title, as you say, was originally written in rhyme, and then he rewrote it. And so I've done the rewritten version. And also it shows how poetry changes, how poetry travels.
Yes, how interesting. We'll talk a little bit about rhyme in a while because you have translated some of his work from rhyme into rhyme. There's so many options that are given in this opening poem about what a poem can be. Syllable magic, a godless prayer, philosophy and meter, most intimate line, one that cannot be plotted. And this poem was written over 20 years ago. For you translating it more recently, which were the ones that stuck out to you?
Well, it's funny. Yeah, funny you should ask that. So there are things in it which reoccur in Durs's work several times. So, for example, that image of the seabed, poetry as a diver, comes up again in a very beautiful poem called "Asked What It Is." Asked what it is, meaning poetry. And so it's there, or the syllable magic. There's a lot of number magic that goes on in Durs's poems, which one day I think I should write about. And the mystery, I guess, the mystery. But for me, just spontaneously, really, he won the 𝙆𝙆𝙘𝙗𝙝 Prize in 2022, I want to say, and he picked a poem by Herbert to talk about called "The Pebble," and it just reminded me here. I talk about it in the introduction as well. These light things that skip across maybe into the infinite, but are so human as well. They're things, and I think for me, Durs ranges so powerfully between the large idea, the reaching towards the infinite, but also the human, the pebble in the hand. And everybody remembers skipping stones when they were young.
Yes, yeah. 5 or 6 or 7 times if you're lucky, yeah.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah. Karen, you're an academic, you're a professor in Oxford, and you began your academic life researching the underground poetry, art and music scene that existed in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm curious if there's any skipping stones that you can trace for us between that beginning and then this work of translation of Durs Grünbein that you're doing now.
Yes, of course. So Durs Grünbein was, on the margins of that scene, actually, in East Germany in the late 80s. So this was really a whole generation of writers born probably in the late 50s, 60s and beyond, who never had the opportunity to publish in the socialist state. They were barred from official publishing. And so that energy, that extraordinary kind of poetic and creative energy went into a really extraordinary, vibrant scene of music, painting, poetry, mostly people living in squats, living illegally, and a network of amazing magazines and readings. So Durs was on the margins of that scene even then, and there are some gorgeous poems with pictures and illustrations with artists in some of the magazines. And so I think that's where I first really came across him, and I thought, oh, this is something special. But there were many poets at that time that I thought were doing something which was completely outside the main Anglophone traditions. Very exciting, that poetry under pressure in some way and what happens to it. And so I just really wanted to write about it, but also to bring it into English because nobody knew it in this country, in America, in the UK.
Last night, when you were both presented with the prize, Durs said, "I hope as well that poetry is a support to ideas of democracy and humanity. That's my training in poetry. That's why I'm writing poetry." Do you see a through line from the beginnings of your encounters with his work and what he said last night? And I suppose the idea of aesthetic in conversation with a public moral good?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. He is a poet that has always been profoundly committed to that sense of poetry as something that is not for the individual, but is in connection with a kind of responsibility to the world. He has been very outspoken about Russia's war in Ukraine, about many important political moments. And Yes, so I'm proud to be associated with that. There is a kind of real moral and political seriousness in his work, which I find powerful and necessary.
I've got about 50 questions for you, Karen, about translation. I'm only going to choose a few of them. You'll be glad to hear. But first of all, I suppose I want you to locate translation for us as something that perhaps most people are doing most of the time. I find myself thinking about, what I'm thinking and then what I say and then what you might hear me say and what you might comprehend in terms of what I say, that each of those are layers of translation as well. Could you, as somebody who works in this so profoundly and in so many different ways, could you let us know about what it is that you, as a professional translator of literature, also know about the kind of translation that's happening in most people most of the time?
Well, you're right. We all translate all of the time. It's just in the kind of micro movements and the situations, we're understanding everything. We're translating it all the time. So you're absolutely right. But I think that actually art puts it onto another level. And every artist is actually translating, whether it's from an idea, an image, a sound, a line that then rises within them and then has to find expression. The great German poet Friedrich Hölderlin talked about the translation as finding a sort of correspondence in something that was foreign but analogous. And I think that's really interesting. It's about watching the shapes of ideas and sounds shift into a new medium. And then that, of course, becomes explicit, a sculpture, in stone or colour, or between languages. So I think all art is translation, but of course, it's very exciting to trace that movement across languages. And I think one of the marks of a great poet, actually, is that they change the medium as they move through it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that there's a recognition and perhaps even a necessity that a translation must reckon with the limitations of itself, and that's perhaps where the art occurs? Or do you look for a perfect translation if such a thing's possible? I'm curious to hear your insight on those things.
A perfect translation. So there are so many answers to that. I think it's a very good question. I'm often aware that I'm never sure that I've finished a translation. So sometimes there's a deadline, and that's that's the end of the translation.
That's the finish,
which is sometimes quite useful. But I think they often I feel. Looking at it, there's something I notice, and often I leave translations for a long time. They sit for quite a long time before I publish them. And my own sense of the language changes, or, it changes with me, and something that didn't seem possible becomes possible. And so I'm very interested in that. But it's... I wonder whether it's the same with any work of art, but I have a feeling that artists sometimes really know that that's the moment it's finished. And I don't know any translator that really feels that a translation is ever finished. It's always somehow underway and might change. But there was a very good part at the beginning of your question, which I've now forgotten, which I wanted to answer. The loss. I mean, everyone talks about... what's lost in translation and the awareness of that. But I really like to focus on the other side of it and what is gained in translation. First of all, I mean, of course, everything would be lost if nobody did it. So, first of all, there's a gain. But also sometimes poems take on new lives in different languages. They become different things. They respond to the times differently. They acquire different meanings. And so I'm a great believer in looking at it as a kind of expansion. And you set something off into the blue, and who knows what it will become.
In your Afterwards project, you described the afterlife a work can find in translation. You've written an extraordinarily helpful introduction to this Griffin 2025 prize-winning book, Psyche Running, Poems in Translation from Durs Grünbein. And the introduction says, I do not have a theory of translation and have always found such theories uniquely unhelpful for the moments when one is on one's own with language, not quite on one's own. And then you go on to reference Rilke and Celan and Brodsky and Dickinson, etc., that you find in Grünbein's work. But like the opening of that paragraph, I do not have a theory of translation. I found that so helpful from someone who was so adept and clearly such an expert in translation. Could you bring us into the kind of playfulness that you have within knowing the theories but then not having one?
Oh, well, there's a great line from Brecht where he, when he was young, and he talks about having theories of poetry, and he says that he has one, no, he has two, no, he has three. He has them hot in his pocket like potatoes, and I really love the idea of the hot potato in the pocket. No, I mean, I laughed sort of writing that because, of course, I teach translation theory, and I hope my students won't look at that sometimes. But no, there are so many, and I think translation theories are a very helpful way to talk about translation and to make sense of some of the things that people do. So from that side, I've got a lot from it, and it's a tool which allows you to say quite a lot about certain things. And there have been great recent translators like Emily Wilson, her Homer, and where she talked about feminist translation. There are those moments when people really define something about translation. But actually, I mean, I was genuine. When you're there with the text, none of that matters. I think it's about you and the text. And it just, there's no reckoning with how visible or invisible you're going to be or what you're... No, all that's gone. There's a kind of a very profound and lonely interchange.
I was fascinated by Sasser Dugdale's translator's note in Maria Stepanova's book, In Memory of Memory, the book or shortlisted translation, where she spoke about living translation, back and forth between the two of them in conversation. And last night, when you were accepting the award, you said that Durs is generous with his comments, but then leaves you alone to do it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about translating a living writer, and a living writer where the two of you know each other and are acquainted, if not really close friends, I'm not sure.
Well, of course, sometimes it's really good to have a poet who's safely dead.
That adjective, Karen, safely dead. You will be quoted on that for other reasons.
But not that I wish that on anybody that I translate, obviously. No, it is a kind of very intimate exchange, really. Can be quite a bruising one. It's not always easy. Not with Durs, I mean, but in general. I love working with living writers. I mean, that's what excites me. I mean, to be honest, to kind of feel that electricity, feel that the way that language moves. And I like Sasha's comment about, the back and forth of living languages. I think Durs and I have known each other for a long time now, and I think you do begin to hear. You begin to hear the rhythms. You begin to hear the voice. You begin to know. You get more confident in knowing exactly what's going on in a poem. But he often surprises me. He goes in a new direction, and there's something else to get my head around. When I said that about being generous, I mean there are lots of references in Durs's poem. It's a kind of very intellectual poetry. Sometimes I feel a bit overwhelmed. Particle physics, the books I've read on particle physics, or there was an essay about Nazi motorway building, and I have to say I know more about Nazi motorway building than anybody probably should now. So there's a lot of research in it. But sometimes there are hidden quotations, there are hidden references, and you just notice that something goes wrong with the rhythm there. There's something that sounds different, and he's often very generous. Not that I ask him generally what something means, but I say I don't quite see this. And then he talks. And then he just sort of talks about the poem. And I say, okay, yeah, got it.
Got it.
But then he doesn't look over my shoulder, which is a wonderful thing, I think, as a translator. He allows the poem to kind of find its way into English.
He was born in Dresden and lives in Berlin and Rome at the moment. And there is a lengthy poem on the downfall of my city, that has many sections. I wonder if you'd be able to read number 3 of those on page 21.
Say after me, it doesn't take much to make a moonscape of a city, or charcoal of the folk who lived there. Imagine this. In the time it takes to nip out of the opera for a pack of fags, the streets were death traps, bubbling with tar. Just now, frost, hands frozen blue on the handlebars. Then the sea of houses was raked by desert winds. Stiff as pharaohs in their winter coats they burned. Never was a summer hotter. The last alarm hardly faded, and the ashes were still warm.
This poem really highlights much of what you say about his interest in morality, in time, in ways within which serious poetry, paying attention to history, and not only history, but the present as well, in terms of it brings to mind every destroyed city that we see on the news every day.
Absolutely. This is a very powerful book-length poem about the Allied destruction of Dresden, but it's about war, it's about aggression, it's about destruction, and it's also about what is wrecked, but also what survives, what comes out of that. So it's a devastating poem, but also in a way a kind of hopeful poem as well in the end.
Yeah. Memory seems to be an enormous theme for him. Later on in number 8 in that sequence, he says, how long ago was that? Don't ask me, I can't say. The only word I know for gone forever is today. You say that, I suppose, through the conversation with and translation with his work. What is the function of memory in poetry as you see it?
Oh, you don't go for the small questions, do you? He talks about poetry capturing a kind of capturing time, capturing human time, but also capturing the past, capturing the future, even a device for capturing the future. So I think poetry is something that can hold these things together in layers, and the poet with these extraordinary antennae for the vibrations of the past in the present and the present in the future, captures them, brings them together and holds them in this extraordinary structure, this holding, this vase, this thing that is the poem. There's a lot of in porcelain. Again, something I want to write about one day. There are extraordinary number of looking devices. So there's magnifying glasses or lamps, or you look in a telescope up to the planets. So all these different scales, but it's always about the perception. It's always about perceiving, and how as you look, things can change. Past, future, present, they come together, but they also can change through the looking. So it's a very it's a huge theme for Grünbein. He's a poet that really wrestles, especially with the German past, but with all our pasts and our futures, and it's all written, I think, in the hope that it can help towards a better future.
Yeah, as he said with his acceptance remarks last night. In that particular book that you translated, Porcelain, Poems on the Destruction of My City, Poems on the Downfall of My City, it seemed to me, looking through all the ones that you translated, that they were all 10-line poems, decimas, and rhyming as well. Like in the one that you read out, make, take, folk, fags, tar, handlebars, alarm, warm. how do you work with particular form in the original language, and then working with form in terms of line length or line count, or syllabic beat, or rhyme when you're going into English?
Well, I think for me, it's this sequence especially is about forms being broken. It's about porcelain being smashed and then mended in some way. And so that is intrinsic. That's held in the form of the poem itself. And so it was really important to me that it did come across into a form that captured exactly that did it, enacted it as it talked about it. I think a lot of people, this has been translated, or parts of it have been translated into other languages, and they haven't done that. And I just think, no, it's got to be. So it was very important, but then how do you do it? And I suppose it is very difficult. German rhymes much more easily than English because all the verbs finish in the same way, pretty much. So you've got automatic rhymes. And this poem draws on, and this was also important, classical rhythms. So it's sort of built around these kind of hexameters or alexandrines, but then that are broken as well, smashed, And so you had to get that feeling in English. But of course, in English, we don't really, that's not our tradition. We move from the iambic pentameter. That's the basic beat of everything we are. And so it was a question of kind of finding something where you could capture that without it feeling too foreign, too strange. But yes, and of course there are compromises you have to make, and certainly I work generally with half rhyme or para-rhyme, as most English language contemporary poets do. But yeah, in a poem about form and smashed forms and redeemed forms, it seemed to me, absolutely vital.
Durs Grünbein's poetry is noted by many, and he's translated and commented upon widely. He is a world poet, and his ideas of philosophy and antiquity are present in so many of his works. But so also, and you highlight this in your introduction, are things, the thingness of things. And I wasn't expecting to burst out laughing when I read this translation of yours, but a fantasy on public lavatories on page 12 had me guffawing, and I'm very kind of pleasantly in a bawdy way. I wonder if you could read it, because I'm curious if you can read it with a straight face, and then also to talk about the presence and what he does with things, and I suppose the human experience of things in this brilliant poem.
A fantasy on public lavatories. Imagine how we would have passed through halls as rinsed of light, as shadowy as these. How, sitting behind Doric columns with a view of the soothsayers' stalls, we would have relieved ourselves, man and woman, side by side. No sense of shame would have prevented us from laughing at the old bald guy farting, deep in conversation with himself, as if his backside were the celebrated Omphalos, navel of the earth, his wind, the distant oracle of Delphi. I'm so pleased you laughed. I think there's a lot of humour in Grünbein, and sometimes, we've been talking about the seriousness of his project and, daring to be serious, but there's a lot of humour in there, which is sometimes missed. He plays with voices, he splices together different voices and ironises himself a great deal. So, yes, so completely. And yeah, that's a strand throughout his work. I love this poem. I'm very pleased I chose it and definitely wanted it in. I never get to read it, actually, so that's rather fun.
Because there's a seriousness to the ways in which he treats thing, a lavatory, and to speaking about a public lavatory. But then he talks about the human experience of it, of people near each other, hearing the intimacies of each other's bodies, hearing the ways within which a person's body, the thing of their body, is also a conversation with themselves and with time and history. history. It's such a deft thing he does. What was it that was in your mind in terms of bringing this to translation, and also what is it that you want to say about it that is more serious than it seems?
I think it takes some guts, doesn't it, to have the old bald guy farting and the Oracle of Delphi, within a couple of lines.
It's a deft turn.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love that. The down to earthness, but also and the humour, but also the constant sense of the fragility and the mortality of everybody. I'm so interested you pick up on the bodiliness, because there are a lot of poems about the soft spots, as one poem is called.
Yeah.
The bruises, the scars, the parts of our body that register the shocks of and the pleasures of life, and that's what makes it so human, actually, so human. Michael Hoffman talked about not translating Durs anymore because of what he called the marble in him. And I can see what he means. There's a kind of interest in the classics, you get that there. But I think there's always such an awareness of the human. And we're absurd, aren't we? Humans are absurd.
Yeah, that's true. Coming back to some of the more serious work that he has, there's a famous line with which he finishes "Words don't sleep" in your translation. I wonder if you could read that poem on page 135 from Learning Old Vocabulary. And I'd love to finish off with hearing that poem and hearing your reflection on translation and the ways that words aren't sleeping through your translation.
On learning old vocabulary. Words don't sleep in dictionaries. They kick about aimlessly on street corners, play with munitions, like kids that carry war inside even when it's done. We never would have guessed, Herr Nobel, that dynamite might make them interchangeable, material, morality, modern art. Particles that went flying from that day, articles in all the scientific journals, thousands per subject, a desert track of knowledge. And the great gulf between this and that meaning of devotion, the satellite pictures of delirium or democracy. Who did this? Who destroyed it all? The baby face that breathed in smog and blew it out as a cloud of gold dust. It's down to him, who sold the dawn for scrap. Don't stop the dictation, you poets. Words don't sleep.
It's like an artistic manifesto, this brilliant poem.
Yes, yeah. It's so interesting. We had a discussion once about this on for a podcast and this poem, and against the sort of German tradition, I was highly aware of how, words can be inflected, poisoned, changed by history. So, for example, the famous word Buchenwald, a beech wood. But of course, since the fascist regime in Germany, it is also a concentration camp. So you can never say the word beechwood, Buchenwald, now in German without that. But Durs, I thought, was just so interesting because he saw it the other way, and he saw how words are constantly changing, picking up power, becoming dynamite. The image is there, and changing as they go, and taking on new possibilities. And I think for a poet that's it, isn't it? You're handling this dynamite. You're bringing it into circulation. You're moving it, through languages. So yeah, it's a fantastic poem that goes to the very stuff of what poetry is about. These words they're alive, and you have them. You take hold of them just for a brief instant, but almost they change. They're out of your hands, and they're already changing, becoming something else.
I was so struck when you were reading it just now with all of the verbs in it too. Kick, play, carry, and then later on destroy, breathe, blew, sold. In a certain sense, the verbs itself are doing something very similar on a level within in the structure of that poem.
Yeah, the transactions. Yeah, the interchanges. Yeah, you're quite right. I'm not sure I'd seen that.
But you were showing it to us,
yes,
which is part of the demonstration of translation as art. Yeah. Karen, as we began, you said that this is a great honour for you and for Durs' work, and also that it's a great uplifting of translation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of translation and why it is that is something that you give so much of your time and energy and expertise and skill to, and why it is that we need more of it in the world.
Well, translation is so human. I think, we live in a world that tends towards the insular, tends towards the xenophobic, tends towards the inward-looking, and translation is the opposite of all that. It's a kind of political force to explode those tendencies, and it's now more necessary than ever. And so I do believe in it as art. I believe in it as political, necessarily political. And I believe in it as a kind of profoundly human activity, which goes back to what you were saying about we're always constantly translating in our interactions with others. It's also sort of so it's a democratic thing, isn't it? When you can meet someone from a different experience, a different culture, a different way of thinking and outlook on the world, and you can find common ground in a kind of shared experience. So I think it's a kind of poetry for peace. It's you can't really bomb someone while you're translating them.
And Karen Leeder, your translation of Durs Grünbein's book Psyche Running has won the 2025 Griffin Prize for Poetry. Congratulations to both of you, and it's been a great pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.